thank you for joining us today for SHRM's webcast, Proposed USCIS Fee Increases, What HR Needs to Know. This program is the first installment in the 2023 season of the SHRM Global Talent Webcast series. You can learn more about upcoming and on-demand events from our e-newsletters and by visiting the SHRM webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM would like to thank Barry Appelman and Leiden, or BAL, for sponsoring this installment of the series, making it possible for SHRM to offer this webcast at no cost to the HR and business community worldwide. Before we start, we want to provide a quick overview of the SHRM webcast interface. On your screen, you'll see today's presenters, the title slide for today's presentation, and the Q&A widget. You can move each box by clicking and dragging it and change the size of the display in the upper right corner window. The slides box is where we'll share the SHRM certification and recertification credit number towards the end of the program. It's also where you will see the content provided by today's speakers. Viewing this full program qualifies for one PDC toward SHRM CP and SHRM SCP recertification from the Society for Human Resource Management. If for any reason you experience any issues viewing the program, please use the Q&A widget to get your question to our tech support team, and we'll do our best to assist you as soon as we can. This widget's also where you may submit your questions for the panelists, which will be addressed during the Q&A portion of the webcast towards the end of the discussion. We also want to briefly highlight SHRM's advocacy team, which is composed of over 19,000 HR professionals and is the core driver of positive workplace policy in action. The A-Team exists to provide HR professionals with opportunities to directly influence and advance sound workplace policies. You can join the A-Team by texting A-Team to 52886, that's A-Team to 52886, or by clicking the Join the SHRM A-Team photo on your screen. Today's program will explore U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS's proposed increases and their potential impacts on HR professionals and business executives' immigration programs and talent acquisition priorities. Our panel of experts will discuss the USCIS fee increase timeline and structure, the potential impacts on immigration programs, budgeting and briefing strategies, the business community's response, and the next steps in the regulatory process. Now, I'd like to introduce the speakers for today's program. Our moderator, Amy Leiter, is partner in BAL's Santa Clara, California office. She works with high-volume corporate clients to craft long-term immigration solutions that ensure mobility of executives, managers, and specialized knowledge workers in an unpredictable environment. She handles extraordinary ability cases for scientists and researchers and focuses on leveraging technology to improve the quality and delivery of legal services. Next, we have Kelly Dunning. Kelly is a partner in the San Francisco office of BAL. She joined BAL after a 17-year career with USCIS and INS, where she headed the agency's legal strategies in the Western US. Kelly currently leads BAL's I-9 practice, advising clients on immigration compliance and program strategy. Next is Eileen Lohman. Eileen is a senior associate in the Washington, D.C. office of BAL. As part of their government strategies team, she analyzes legislative and policy developments in immigration law. She also advises clients on various compliance issues, including I-9 and E-Verify obligations, and assists clients in performing audits of their immigration programs. Finally, we have Steve Plastrick. Steve served as an associate counsel at USCIS's Vermont Service Center, where he advised USCIS officers on employment-based non-immigrant eligibility issues and coordinated litigation defense strategies for the agency. So thank you, Amy, Kelly, Eileen, and Steve for joining us today. With that, I'm pleased to turn over the webcast microphone to the moderator of today's discussion, Amy Leiter. Amy, take it away.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We are delighted to be here today to talk about, I think one of everyone's favorite topics is always fees and money and what it costs to run a program in this day and age. And of course, today we're going to focus on this proposed rule that's currently making its way through the rulemaking process in the government to increase the fees for USCIS applications. So, just kind of very high level, I think it's helpful just to remind ourselves, why do we need an increase in the fee schedule at all? And, of course, USCIS may have a different answer for that than maybe we would. But, the fees that USCIS uses for its operations 96% of those fees come from, of its operating budget comes from the fees that are paid by each of these petitions when we submit our petitions. So, so it's a crucial aspect of USCIS's budget. So what they've said is that they're unable to meet their costs with the fees as they currently stand, and so they need to raise them. So what types of effects would we expect to see from those fees being raised? Well, we've all seen the that the adjudications themselves, sometimes we see quality issues with the adjudications, at least those of us working over here on the legal side of things. And that, that can come about perhaps from understaffing. And the other effect of understaffing, of course, that I think every one of us has seen who has ever worked in immigration is the processing times. And so that's something that USCIS is very actively targeting right now and trying to bring down because, there have been a confluence of things over the last 2 years that have kind of caused those to continually be creeping up. So, with that in mind, Eileen, when we look at what has been proposed in this rule, what were some of the themes that stood out to you?
Thanks, Amy, and hi, everyone. So where we are, in terms of where we are in the regulatory process, just to level set a little bit, USCIS proposed this regulation in January and accepted comments from the public until March 13th. So USCIS proposed to increase filing fees for immigration benefits by a 40% weighted average. We'll get more into the numbers shortly, but this average does not capture the increases for employment-based filings. In terms of the philosophy behind this increase, USCIS is really embracing the ability to pay model. And what that means is those who are more capable of bearing the burden of fees pay more for a service than those with less ability to pay. The agency's last attempt to raise fees under the Trump administration was very much focused on each applicant paying for the cost of adjudication of the benefit they were applying for, regardless of their ability to pay. So among other proposals, they limited eligibility for fee waivers, for example. So USCIS isn't abandoning that idea that each beneficiary should pay for the benefit they're requesting, but the overall shift to ability to pay is why you will see a much higher increase proposed for businesses. And in addition to higher filing fees, USCIS is proposing a surcharge on employment-based petitions to cover costs associated with the regulation USCIS began implementing last year to reform asylum processing at the southern border. Unlike previous regulations, this one doesn't make significant changes to immigration policy or agency processing, so no huge change in terms of how you submit applications to the government and how they're processed. The focus is very much on adjusting the fee schedule and, as Amy was mentioning, getting the agency into a place where they can fully cover their costs. I think we can go to the next slide and get into some numbers. Okay, so as you'll see, there are different boxes for different I-129 petitions, which is one of the main changes that this rule would be making. USCIS would no longer charge the same fee for all forms I-129. They would split it based on the classification. And they tried to calculate it based on their actual workload and how long it takes to adjudicate those different classifications. Because as many of you know, they are very different in terms of the burden on adjudicators. They are not proposing to split the form into different forms yet for each classification, but they might do that in the future. It's just not part of this fee rule. So first, USCIS proposed to significantly increase the base filing fees for these classifications. As you can see, one of the biggest increases is the one for the H-1B registration, going from $10 to $215. On top of the higher filing fees, USCIS would then impose that $600 asylum program fee. And that's per petition. That is for each Form I-129 and Form I-140, including renewals and extensions. So that is a very significant increase in government filing fees. And so that's how we end up with the percentages that are in the bottom corner of the slide. Since we're really thinking about this all, on a macro level, it's not just the filing fees, it's all these others. So as I mentioned, USCIS is not proposing significant policy changes, but they are proposing to change the way they calculate the premium processing clock. So currently it's calendar days, and they're proposing to calculate it in business days, which essentially lengthens the time frame if you're not including Saturday, Sunday, federal holidays as part of that time clock. So now I will turn it to Amy to talk about what this means for your companies.
Yeah, these are some pretty significant changes, Eileen, where, especially that program fee, which isn't necessarily applying to every petition, but it looks like they've really zeroed in on the ones that I think most companies are filing the most petitions for, maybe outside of those adjustment of status petitions. So looking ahead to the next slide, I think the question that's going to occur to most of the people listening is, okay, how do I go about figuring out what these new fees are going to do to my program? And so there are a few different ways you can do that. One of the quickest and easiest things you could do is do kind of a, pen and paper calculation if you're so inclined, and just essentially plan to kind of double the fees that you currently spend in your program. So just take your current spend and double it. That'll at least give you a ballpark figure. As alarming as that might sound right out of the gate. So that can give you a quick idea. When you're ready to dig in a little bit further, we recommend that you have a look at the fee calculator that we've developed. There's going to be a link to it. It's here on the slides, and you'll have that available to you, and the slides will circulate afterwards. But you can also see an image of it here on the screen. And essentially, as you can see, it goes through each type of filing that you might be submitting to the government. It lets you put in your estimated number of petitions, and then it's going to calculate what the new fees would be. And what you can't really see from this particular view is that it will also give you a total at the bottom, so that you have an idea that's a little bit more specific to your specific types of filings, for how much you can expect your spend to be under the new regime if it passes as it's currently drafted, which we'll talk about a little bit more in coming slides. A more advanced way to use this calculator would be not just to look at what you have been doing historically, but to do some projections about, the economy is changing this year. The number of petitions that we're filing is changing for a lot of companies. And so you might want to, do those projections first, and then use those numbers to plug into the calculator so that you can get, even more tailored ideas about what you can expect your spend to be once this passes. So I think another of the big questions that we have right now is when people can expect to start paying those additional fees. And Eileen, what's the latest on what we're thinking about when we expect those to come into play?
We are still thinking, so right now they're in the process of reviewing comments and they have to determine how to address all of those in the final rule. That process will take at least several months just to go through the comments and figure out what they're going to do next with the final regulation. So the earliest that we think, and this is really the earliest, would be Q4 of this year, or Q1 of next year.
Perfect. So not immediately, not tomorrow, but coming up soon enough that it's definitely time to start doing some planning around this. Steve, I know you've done some additional analysis of this. Are there any other angles that companies should consider for how to do these comparisons for the increased fees?
Sure. I mean, on their face, the increase in fees, as you can see in this fee calculator, is pretty shocking compared to where the fees have been since the last time they were updated in 2016. But four of us were immigration nerds, so we were thinking about how to put this in a larger context of immigration adjudication trends at USCIS. And that led to some interesting results. In particular, we started looking at how USCIS adjudication trends from different periods during the Trump administration played out and what that meant for the overall expense to different companies. And in other words, USCIS was issuing significantly more requests for evidence and denying significantly more cases in 2017 and 2018 than compared to today. And that meant a lot of companies were paying additional legal fees to respond to RFEs and sometimes paying new filing fees to refile a case that USCIS had denied. And when we started comparing those old trends and current fees with current trends and the proposed fees, the overall increase was significantly lower than you might expect. So the bottom line is that the USCIS trends and the sort of service, for lack of a better word, that USCIS provides has a really huge impact on the overall cost to companies. And it depends on a lot of factors like which petitions you're filing and if they're for new employees or renewals. So please take that bottom line with huge caveats. And maybe this is a rosy spin from a former USCIS attorney, but it was an interesting way to look at these fee increases in the larger context of USCIS trends.
Well, I think it's always helpful to hear a USCIS attorney's perspective, maybe especially when it's rosy, since that's maybe more unusual. So thanks for those insights. Moving on to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about how we got to this point. I think this is another good moment for our experts who are inside the agency to give us kind of some of those insights. So, Steve, how did we get to a point where we have this disparity between the fees that USCIS is taking in and then the costs to the agency?
Yeah, I mean, we knew that a big fee increase was coming, but I think it's really helpful to think about why USCIS is in this situation. And there's a few factors to keep in mind. First, USCIS is a big government agency. It has around 19,000 employees and contractors who work at around 200 offices around the world. And that's a lot of expense to cover. Second, unlike most government agencies, a really, really small amount of USCIS's funding comes from Congress and appropriations. Instead, around 96% of USCIS's funding comes from the fees that companies, petitioners, and applicants pay when they file something with USCIS. So even when Congress does allocate some taxpayer money to USCIS, they're often directed to a specific purpose, and the agency doesn't really have flexibility to use that money for something else that it might need money for. On the other hand, the money that USCIS gets from filing fees goes into its examinations fee account, which has a lot of flexibility, and the agency can use it for a lot of different purposes. So the bottom line is that the agency is really, really heavily dependent on filing fees just to keep the lights on and their machines running. And a third thing to keep in mind about how we got here is that USCIS is supposed to go through this process of adjusting fees every 2 years. But for a variety of reasons, they haven't gotten the fees updated since 2016. Some of the reasons there are it's a complex, lengthy process, it takes time, and also their most recent attempt in 2020 was struck down in litigation for a variety of reasons. And since they haven't updated their fees in a long time, that means that this increase in the proposal is quite large. But another thing is that USCIS has also been asking companies, applicants, and USCIS employees to do a lot more with the same amount of money that they've had. So for example, forms have gotten a lot longer and take longer to process. That's just a fact. They've added questions and added steps along the adjudication process internally that cost money and cause delays. And USCIS officers have to take time to review those new questions and documents that they're requesting. At the same time, USCIS site visits and additional scrutiny from the agency's Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate has also added additional costs, as do the security checks that officers have to complete. So on a more positive note, USCIS has been aware of these issues, and we know they're already implementing efficiencies where they can, and also engaging with stakeholders so that they can learn more about what these pain points are for everyone and figure out how to improve that experience. So there is some improvement there already, but that's part of how we're in this situation, is they've been making things more complicated and lengthy on their end. Another reason why we're in this situation is that USCIS has been operating under a huge budget shortfall for a number of years. You might remember back in summer 2020 when USCIS announced that they were very, very close to laying off about 70% of their employees because they just didn't have the funding. Well, that funding issue has not magically gone away. And under the current fees, USCIS is on track for a $1.8 billion shortfall this year, and that's billion with a B. And that's not to improve services, that's just a shortfall to keep doing what they're doing. And you know that that is not always perfect service. So there's a lot of things that go into the mix that have led us to this point. And that was a lot of explanation from me on why we're seeing such a fee increase. But I also want to talk about what we can expect these fees to do. And first and foremost, these higher fees are going to go toward hiring more than 7,000 new staff for USCIS, which will help the agency work through some of the customer service, adjudication delays, and just other issues that they've been facing for a number of years. For example, you might have seen earlier today, USCIS announced that they're opening a virtual service center to process certain kinds of humanitarian applications and other benefits. And they laid out a plan for how they'll continue staffing that up with around 500 officers and employees over the next 2 years. So they're making progress on staffing up already, but the increase in fees will also allow them to hire more officers. One thing that this won't do is that we don't expect that this will increase the or speed up the timeline for online filings or other technology improvements. I know we're all really eagerly waiting for those efficiencies and improvements, and the agency is making progress on it, but our understanding is that higher fees won't really speed that process up. It's on a separate track with separate funding. But I really want to go back to hiring more staff because that's just a huge thing. More officers to be able to adjudicate, more people who can process, and having worked at the USCIS Vermont Service Center, not as an adjudicator, I can say firsthand that the agency has been short-staffed for many, many years, and the effects of that just like ripple out across everything. And I really want to bring in Kelly at this point because I know you have really great firsthand experience with all of this as you were managing folks at USCIS. So do you have any insight into just the effects of the short staffing and how big of a problem that's been?
Yeah, no, those are all really, really good points. And I think the staffing, especially during the Trump administration and during COVID, USCIS, even in the field offices, not just the service centers, lost a lot of employees that they were not able to rehire back until this new administration came in. And then secondly, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing across industries here in the United States, there's just a workforce that is ready to retire and they're ready to move on. And so we're starting to see that a lot now in USCIS as well. And so they need to bring a whole new crew of people in to fill that gap of those, taking the spaces for those retired officers. So lots of challenges for sure in terms of that staffing side of the house.
And I noticed there's one more bullet point on here for how we ended up in this situation. If we could go back to the previous slide. Other than staffing, is there another driver that is contributing to this need for higher fees at USCIS?
Yeah, this is a really great point. So yes, and I think we're really seeing this, especially in these last 2 to 3 years. It's that humanitarian effort that's going on. And I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about this, additional $600 fee for the asylum petitions. So just a quick background. USCIS is very active in the humanitarian field. And I think most people who think of humanitarian cases think of the asylum and refugee programs, right? So the asylum program are for those folks who are already here in the United States and they cannot be returned back to their home country due to persecution or some type of horrific event that is happening in their home country. Then you've got the refugee core, who are people that are currently outside the United States, but the United States has agreed to bring them here to the United States, again, due to the persecution that they are facing in their home country. And so, we've seen this, especially on the asylum side, we have seen this really grow at our southern border, where you have folks coming from really all over the world, but most apparently from the Northern Triangle countries and still from Mexico, and needing that safe haven here in the United States from their home countries. So you've seen this huge influx of folks coming in and needing asylum relief. In addition to the Biden administration raising the numbers to 125,000 refugee cases every year. So that's also, time needing to be spent to adjudicate those applications, travel for those officers, processing all those applications. So with these significant increases in both the asylum and refugee, the most important thing for those application types is there are no fees that USCIS charges for those application types. And so, as we were saying in the bullet point, these are unfunded programs that USCIS does have an obligation to move forward. So we've seen those programs significantly grow in these last, certainly 3 to 4 years. Now, in addition to that, we've seen additional programs, humanitarian programs that have been added, most notably the United for Ukraine program, the Operation Allies Welcome for the Afghan population. And now we've also seen the addition of the Venezuelan, Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Haitian parole program. All of these programs are being offered at a no-fee cost, meaning the applicant doesn't have to pay any fees, but USCIS has to take the time to adjudicate and process those applications. So again, as Steve, as you were mentioning, there are significant increases in the amount of applications that USCIS is needing to adjudicate, and for some of these folks in a very quick manner because of the emergency need that they find themselves in. And but we're not collecting any fees to pay for these services to move forward. So bottom line is their caseload continues to expand in this, humanitarian space, but they're not getting fees for the work that they're doing. So as Eileen was mentioning earlier, I like to tie this back in that, ability to pay versus the beneficiary paying. So I think we're seeing sort of these significant increases in the fees, not only to help pay for some of these humanitarian programs, but that's also specifically why we're seeing that additional $600 asylum fee in addition to the already raised fees, to help further, the payment of these applications. Now, some would say Congress should be the one appropriating this money. And Steve, I know you talked about that is, shouldn't Congress be providing the money to cover the costs of these humanitarian applications? And so, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress into our next comments. But yes, I mean, there's certainly that discussion of, should it really be put on the business community to pay for these fees, or is this something that Congress should be appropriating to help pay for the fees? So with that, I will turn it back over to Amy.
So I'm going to jump in on this next slide, and looking ahead, we have a sort of a flow chart here of how we've gotten to this point. The main question is sort of how are we gathering information here? And Eileen, could you talk about the advocacy part of this?
Yes, absolutely. So the main advocacy channel for this is they're going through the formal notice and comment rulemaking process. And the great thing about that is that means they have to give the public notice of a proposed change and let literally anyone comment on it. And so right now, the comments are still being posted in the public docket, but they're starting the process of going through those. So that USCIS did receive a very strong response from the public, thousands of comments. And so that was really the primary way that stakeholders made their voice heard, and really told the government what they thought about these fee increases. And then we do see a potential for litigation challenging this rule once it's finalized. There's no way to predict that right now because we're still pretty early in the process. You can't file a lawsuit against a proposed regulation. So we're still at that stage. But that's just something to be aware of, that, depending on what's in the final regulation, there could be additional advocacy in the form of litigation.
And if I could jump in there, Eileen, on that too, I think, and that's also there were a lot of questions on litigation in the chat. So kind of addressing that a little bit more fuller, as Steve had previously said, in 2020, the proposed fee increase that was issued by the Trump administration ended up being stopped, right? So basically it was supposed to take effect in 2020, and an injunction by a district court ended up stopping that fee rule from moving forward. And I think what's interesting is in that decision, Judge White stated that the government didn't provide any data or statistics to why the fees needed to be increased. So in this particular fee rule or proposed rule that we're seeing, we see the Biden administration actually taking a more strategic approach by providing some of that data and statistics about why the fees need to be increased to a certain extent based upon some of those additional those additional time frames that it's taking, additional programs, so on and so forth. So I think that's where we're seeing sort of that different rule. So back to Eileen's point about, do we think litigation will stop this proposed, or when it comes to a final rule? We don't know for sure, right? It's really going to depend upon, if they take our comments to heart and they make these fees a little more reasonable, as we would all like to see them. But I think really it's going to come down to, does the data and statistics support the increase, right? We know that they need fees. I mean, we've just talked about all the reasons why they need these fees to be increased. I mean, there's no question. I think what the comments are trying to say, and I think, hopefully advocating on all of your behalf, in terms of, SHRM's position is, fine. We know that the fees need to be increased, but let's make sure that they're reasonable. And so if they do their job supporting it with that data and statistics, I'm not sure necessarily litigation will stop this final rule from actually moving forward. But if they don't do their homework and they, do sort of similar to what the Trump administration did and not really provide the reasons why those fees need to be increased, then I think we could see potentially some litigation maybe being successful. But I think, certainly more to come on whether or not litigation will actually stop these fees from being able to move forward.
So it sounds like we're pretty much counting on litigation happening, but the only question is kind of how effective we can expect it to be. So kind of for all of our panelists, do we have any other predictions on what we might expect from the final rule and kind of, just from what we know already?
Sorry, getting to the mute button. The one thing I would say is that it is possible USCIS could make changes to the fee levels. I don't think, there's no way we can predict exactly what they will be in the final rule, but given the very strong, detailed responses that the agency is receiving from different stakeholders all across the immigration system, I think it is certainly possible that it will look different than it does now.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of questions in the chat about, do we expect that any of our comments will actually affect the decision, right, in terms of what USCIS will ultimately come back at? I do. I think, from what we're seeing, and, Eileen's looking at those comments and evaluating them, but I do think that, there's been a lot of really thoughtful comments that I've put forth, and, asking for reasonableness. I think, we've also seen some folks who are asking, and this is another question in the chat, is, do we think processing times will get better if these fees go up, right? And as Steve has said, yeah, there's so much in the hole at this point that we don't know necessarily that these fees, it's really going to be going to added staffing, and, hopefully we will see processing times come down. But we do know that in years past, when these fee increases have gone through, USCIS has had to make promises to Congress and to the public that processing times will come down if they are allowed to have these fees go forward. So I do think there's a lot of conversation. I do think USCIS is really looking at that, and that is definitely something that the all of you and the communities that are affected by this fee rule have commented back to USCIS to consider in making sure, like, hey, if we're okay with paying these fees, then we need something on the back end. Most specifically, we want these processing times to come down so that we're not waiting forever for our cases to get processed. So I do think more to come, and I do think our comments can certainly have an impact in shaping how we might see a proposed final rule look.
Yeah, and speaking of those comments, I know that we've done some analysis on the comments that came in and who the stakeholders were and sort of some of the big picture themes there. Eileen, could you talk a little bit about kind of some of what we saw out of those comments?
Yes, absolutely. And to emphasize, this, of course, we're more clued into and focused on the impact on employment-based immigration categories. But as Steve and Kelly were explaining, USCIS is a huge agency. They're responsible for all immigration benefit requests. So this is an expansive regulation. It's more than 200 pages long, and it affects all areas of the immigration system. So we've really seen responses coming from every type of stakeholder that has an interest in immigration, whether it's business, humanitarian groups, touring musicians, even the Small Business Administration. And from the business community, the common themes are, as we've been discussing, the transparency. There are a lot of concerns that there just isn't enough of an explanation in the proposed rule for some of the increases. One of the examples is the H-1B registration fee going up by more than 2,000% after the agency really just instituted this process only a few years ago and said that $10 was going to be enough. So that was a very common concern in the comments, that they need more information about how they were calculated, how USCIS will determine the final amounts, and then how they'll actually address them in the future. Because another common concern is that this is all based on historical data. So if fees go up by such a large extent, companies and applicants might behave differently in their filing patterns in the future. And so there needs to be more information about how things will be reviewed going forward. And then knowing that fees will go up to some extent, of course, everyone's asking for them to be lower in the final rule, that goes without saying. But knowing that they'll have to increase to some extent, employers want meaningful improvements to services, as you're all, rightly bringing up with the processing times. That's really the top ask from everyone, is that we need to at least get back to reasonable processing times. SHRM submitted a great comment urging USCIS to make electronic filing available in all categories, and other groups also echoed that request. And one other point that I don't have on the slide, but some groups are pushing back against the proposed change to the premium processing timelines. They have concerns that that's really the only way right now to get a predictable processing timeline. And so it's hard to swallow the idea that you might be paying more for a longer service, longer processing time. And so the American Immigration Lawyers Association, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Business Roundtable and other groups all said, we really want you to keep the calendar day timeframe, not the business day timeframe. But it should be very interesting to see how, the government is, as I've been saying, they have to review all of these, and then they have to address them in the final rule. They're not going to make every single change people request, but they have to say why they're not. So it'll be interesting.
And we can expect that to take a little bit of time when they received so many comments. So again, that's part of what's playing into the timeline here, where we're talking about implementation, isn't it? Well, looking ahead to the next slide, whenever we have a proposed rule or potential new rule, I think we go through kind of these stages of action. And so, initially we were just monitoring for what does this change mean, analyzing the rule to see, where we think the changes are going to really have an impact. And then, looking at briefing our businesses and then actually taking action. And so, thinking about that spectrum, where do we think that companies should be on this spectrum today?
I can
I'll
jump
open
in.
it to any of you.
I was going to say,
there you go.
Steve, you jump in first.
Whoever would like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my thought right now is companies are sort of in the place where they're thinking through how to communicate this information to their internal stakeholders and thinking about how to communicate this up the chain at your company. And this could include crunching the numbers on how many petitions you've filed historically using the fee calculator on the BAL website. or just thinking about projecting how these fees would impact your ability to run your immigration program and sponsor additional foreign national workers.
Eileen and Kelly,
Exactly.
anything else you would add? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's two approaches, right? So there's the one approach of, as Steve was saying, like run the numbers, using the calculator, figuring out how is this going to impact your program, and then reporting that up to your C-suite to like kind of give them that, hey, heads up, here's what may be happening. Here's how this is going to impact our immigration program, whether it's through recruitment, through retention. But then there's also another school of thought that, as we've been saying, this is still a proposed rule. So we don't know what the final rule is going to look like yet. We're not sure. So it could be these fees, or it could be something much less than this that might not have as significant of an impact on your program. So I know I'm working with some companies who are like, hey, we're going to run the numbers on our immigration team to see what that impact might be, but we're not going to report it up the chain yet because we don't want to freak our CFO out or or our CEO, and kind of get you don't want to sound the whistle yet, just because we don't know what it will be. So they're kind of keeping it close hold, and they're waiting, kind of a wait and see. Like, I'm not going to do anything till I know exactly what the impact is going to be. So you all knowing how your company operates, right? So I think we're seeing people do it sort of that both ways, but understandably, these fees will definitely have an impact. So I think you're certainly going to want to run those numbers to see what the impact might be to your in-house program, for sure.
And I think one of the places that, we've talked about that we're expecting litigation is that asylum fee, that additional $600 that's, that's potentially going to be applied to the I-129s and the I-140s. And so, in terms of projecting, of making those projections, I think maybe that's one of those reasons that people are a little hesitant to make full projections yet. So I know I have some clients who are also making kind of two sets of projections, one that includes the asylum fee and one that doesn't. And again, the BAL calculator can help you run those kinds of, alternate scenarios as well.
Yeah, and just because there's lots of questions in the chat about that too, just as as Amy said, clarification. So the $600 asylum fee would be on top of the increased fees for each of those application types, right? So for the I-129 and the I-140. And it would be for any non-immigrant visa that you're applying for on that I-129, right? Or any visa or permanent, if you're moving towards keeping that or sponsoring that person for a green card, same thing on that I-140. It would cover all of those categories. And then same on your non-immigrant visas. It could be for change of employer. It could apply to your extensions. So so the way it's worded in the proposed rule is it would apply to all of those. So there's a lot of questions in the chat on that as well. So just understanding where that fee, and so I think what Amy recommends is kind of running those numbers with the fee and without that $600 fee, and without it, to give you a better view of what that looks like. Yes.
And then also keeping an ear out for that potential litigation and kind of seeing where that goes in coming months as we get some more finality on the rule.
And then one other thing too is, like, there's some questions in the chat as well about, well, is there going to be any kind of grandfathering, right? If I'm filling out applications now, am I going to be impacted? Will these fees apply to, like, will I still have to pay under the old fees, or will I have to pay under the new fees? Again, as we said, since this is a proposed rule, any applications that you are filing now and are able to file now under the current rules, you'll have to just pay those fees. There will generally be a time frame by which the agency will move from the old fees to the new fees once the final rule is issued and no litigation stops it. And so there will be a transition time where you will be notified. So for those of you asking in the chat, like, hey, if I'm filing an application today for my employee, will I still be able to pay the lower fees? The answer to that would be yes. You would still be only paying the lower fees while this process is ongoing. And then just be on the lookout, like as we were saying, Q4, most likely beginning of next year, so Q1 sometime in 2024 is when we anticipate USCIS would enact the increased fees.
Kind of at the soonest at this point. And of course, again, that could be delayed by litigation. We might even see that get pushed further, but probably don't need to do that planning for anything sooner than Q4 of this year. Okay, very helpful. Well, looking to the next slide, if you are one of those people who's at the point where you are ready to gather that information and start passing it along to your C-suite, I won't go through all of these right now. We'll circulate these slides afterwards. But this is a resource for you to kind of, guide your comments, the types of things that you may want to consider looking into and then briefing your leadership on. So we wanted you to have something concrete to take away today, so that you feel like you have a starting point. So with that, I know we've also been looking at a number of the questions in the chat as we've gone, but wanted to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end here as well. So if you do have any lingering questions, please do put those into the Q&A, and we'll start to address those. But first, if I can turn it over to Steve for a moment to talk a little bit about another resource that BAL offers to human resources professionals that may be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And that was a great segue, because if you like what you've seen here with this kind of conversation and analysis, and also this kind of internal stakeholder briefing point, we would recommend that you check out BAL Community. This is a new interactive network that is built by and for in-house professionals. And our goal here is to bring in-house immigration professionals together so that you all can share information, best practices, connect with each other, and also engage directly with government officials and policymakers in a new and different way. And so with BAL Community, you get practical advice, policy updates as they happen, and analysis that's really clear and concise, delivered into your email inbox. Weekly benchmarking on immigration program practices, policies, other things you're curious about. Multiple webinar events every month that are only 30 minutes long that focus on different best practices and include speakers from current and former government officials. And there's also opportunities for small off-the-record focus group conversations about tricky operational organizational issues. So bottom line is BAL Community is a new way to help in-house professionals manage the day-to-day of their immigration programs and opportunities to engage with leaders in the field. So that's my little infomercial. And there's also good news that if you use the code SHRM Global Talent 2023 on the community website, you can get 6 free months of BAL Community membership and see if it's a good fit for you. So please check it out with the link on this screen.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, we would really encourage people to give that a try. Nothing to lose when you get 6 months free. It's at least worth seeing if it's a valuable resource for you. And with that, let's turn to some of the questions that we're seeing in the Q&A. Are there any that the panel has seen that you want to address immediately?
I just see one that was interesting about, is there any assistance for small companies? And that is something that has been definitely discussed in comments. There really isn't. The fees don't depend on the size of the company. Of course, there are certain fees that do depend on the size of the company, that are already existing, but the proposal would not differentiate. And so that's one of the things the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has recommended, that USCIS create a tiered structure that doesn't disproportionately place a burden on smaller companies that are unable to cover costs like this. And then actually the U.S. Small Business Administration submitted a comment expressing many concerns with how these fees would affect small businesses. And so that's a pretty big deal for another government agency to comment on another government agency's proposal. And so there currently isn't, but that's something that the agency is definitely going to need to tackle in the final rule somehow.
And there was a similar question along the lines of, do nonprofits have any exemptions for these fees? And are we seeing anything like that?
So I don't think I mean, of course, there's the cap exemption for nonprofits, but the filing fees, I believe, are the same.
Yeah, same. I'm not seeing any differences in terms of, if a nonprofit is going through the same process for applying for one of their employees through that I-129 or I-140, we're not seeing any relief on that front either. Yep.
I'm seeing a lot of questions here as well on kind of timelines, and they fall into a couple of different places, but a lot of questions about, if we see the fees increase, will it only increase certain types of petitions? Do we expect to see these timelines get better across the board? For those of you, maybe Kelly, for you who have managed those timelines internally, what do you think on that front?
I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Yeah. So for timelines, do we expect? No worries. Do we expect that timelines would decrease for specific types of petitions more than others, or would we expect to see it decrease across the board?
Yeah, I mean, we know that USCIS has issued a strategic plan through 2025, and part of that strategic plan has specifically stated their goal processing times for various different petitions, right, and application types. So we know they're already looking at that. And again, we would hope that having that additional staff, right, if they're going to bring on those additional 7,000 folks, we hope that having that additional staff will help bring those processing times down. And then if they can turn to other efficiencies like e-filing, and allowing folks to do some of that kind of e-filing, again, we do really hope that those processing times will be coming down. But that is certainly something I think everybody was asking for in this proposed rule, is, hey, if you're going to increase fees, then we want better processing times. And I think that's going to be USCIS's biggest challenge, is bringing down those processing times, because the expectation is certainly there.
Definitely. Well, and I see that we have only 1 minute left, so maybe I will turn it back over to Andrew at this point for any final comments.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you to all of our panelists. I know that there's no lack of content here. You all have been remarkably engaging, and so is our audience. So thank you to all of you. And again, I know that we could go on for days, but this has been a remarkable conversation, and we're very glad to have you. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for participating in today's conversation, and to our audience as well. You've both been remarkably engaging, so we appreciate you attending today's program. Now, for those in the audience that would like to claim a recertification credit for viewing this program, for a SHRM certification PDC, you can use the program number 23-5KSAJ. That number is on display in the slides window located on the left of your screen. Again, the program number for today's webcast is 23-Kilo Sierra Alpha Juliet. There's also a certificate of completion that's available for download by clicking the yellow SHRM certification button at the bottom of your console. So now that we've concluded, when the program window closes in just a moment, an evaluation form will automatically pop up on your screen. We do ask and hope that you take a few minutes to fill that out, as it helps us assess both this program, but also plan for the rest of the 2023 Global Talent Series season. Now, for those of you that were asking for today's slides, we're more than happy to share those. Feel free to send an email to governmentaffairs@shrm.org. That's governmentaffairs@shrm.org, and we're more than happy to complete that request. So before we sign off, we want to say again, thank you, Amy, Kelly, Eileen, and Steve. Very insightful discussion. Very glad to have you. And finally, we want to thank you, everyone in our audience, for tuning in today, for being with us, and for choosing SHRM as your source for insights and breaking news on all things immigration and global mobility. Thanks again. That concludes today's program.